Well, joining me live from his electorate in Queensland is the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. Jim Chalmers, thanks for your time. Let's get to your cost of living relief in a second. But first, I wanted to ask you about the monthly inflation figure of 4% out this week. Should the Reserve Bank lift rates to get this under control? And should people be alarmed if they do, or realise it just might be necessary to prevent further pain down the track?
Oh, good morning, Andrew. As you know, I don't preempt or predict or give free advice to the Independent Reserve Bank. I am focused on my job, which is to get on top of this inflation challenge which persists in our economy. Inflation is still too high, but it's much lower than what we inherited, and our policies are helping. The Reserve Bank Governor made it clear that turning those two big Liberal deficits into Labor surpluses, having those two surpluses is helpful in the fight against inflation. And we've also designed that cost of living relief to put downward pressure on inflation rather than be part of the problem. And we know from last week in the inflation numbers and also with a report from the ACCC that things like our energy bill relief are actually taking the edge off inflation rather than adding to it.
You've made comments in recent days, sometimes the last part of getting inflation down is the hardest part. Is your 2.75% inflation prediction by the end of the year from your budget too optimistic then?
Oh, it remains to be seen, but we're confident about the future trajectory of inflation, but we're not complacent about it. I think we've made that really clear. And when you compare us to the rest of the world, it's really important that you remember that our inflation peaked later and lower than most of those other countries. But our experience has been very similar otherwise. And both the Reserve Bank Governor and the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank have said in recent days and weeks that our experience of the downward trajectory of inflation is pretty similar to what's happening around the world. We saw in the US, for example, that inflation ticked up a couple of times earlier in the year before it ticked down again. We saw in Canada last week, in fact, that core and headline inflation both ticked up. It's ticking up in the euro area as well. And so our experience is not different to what's being seen around the world. Inflation has moderated in welcome and encouraging ways, but it doesn't always moderate in a straight line. It zigs and zags on the way down, and that's what we're seeing. Indeed,
I noted that figure in Canada. Could it be too optimistic then, 2.75?
Oh, as I said, Andrew, we're confident but not complacent about those forecasts. One of the major changes to the forecasts in the budget as a consequence of our responsible economic management combined with the design of our cost of living relief is that the Treasury did bring forward their forecasts for a return to the inflation targeting band. Obviously, that remains to be seen. There's always an element of uncertainty around that. But we think the way that we've designed this substantial, meaningful but responsible cost of living relief will put downward pressure on inflation rather than upward pressure on inflation, and it will help us get back to band in the estimation of the Treasury, perhaps by the end of the year.
Given there's low unemployment at the moment, could Australia withstand a recession without experiencing that 1990s-style recession which had high unemployment? Why is it important to avoid that technical recession? You obviously would feel it is politically, but is it in the way it used to be?
Well, I think whether you're the government or the Reserve Bank, our job here is to get on top of this inflation challenge without smashing the economy. And obviously the labour market is one of the most important considerations. It's been incredibly resilient. Unemployment around 4% is a pretty remarkable achievement given all the pressures coming at us from around the world and around the country. And so we want to get on top of inflation without seeing a big blowout in unemployment, without seeing our economy go backwards. And what we saw in the March quarter earlier this year was that growth is already incredibly flat. We know from retail figures, we know from savings ratios, and we know from the labour market that the interest rate rises which are already in the system are already hammering consumption, particularly discretionary consumption, and having a big impact on the economy already. And so for the bank and for the government, our goal is to continue to grow, to keep as many people in work as we can at the same time as we get on top of inflation, which remains the big primary challenge in our economy.
And have you told Michelle Bullock that, as I think's been reported, that you want to get on top of inflation without unemployment rising?
Oh, I think Michelle Bullock has made it clear, to her credit, that the job here is to factor in all of these considerations. And the Deputy Governor said only a few days ago that the inflation fight is the primary fight, but they factor in, as do we, a whole range of considerations in the labour market, in the economy more broadly, what's happening around the world. And in that, I think the Reserve Bank and the government have got a similar view, which is we've got to get on top of inflation without smashing the economy. That involves a series of fine judgments. And for me, that means getting the budget in better nick. Those two surpluses are really important, but also designing this cost of living relief so that we can put that downward pressure on inflation and help people who are doing it tough.